Hi, everyone. We're just going to give everyone a few minutes to jump on. I'm sure that's the first time anyone has ever heard that saying, ever. Good morning and welcome, everyone. We're just giving everyone a few minutes to get started here, get logged in. Alrighty, so I want to just do a couple of housekeeping items really quick. If people file in, no worries, I'll repeat myself. We don't have a chat, but we do have a Q&A. So if you want to engage with the panelists, any of us that are speaking today, please use the Q&A boxes section. And then that way, since that is the area that is being monitored actively, we'll be able to respond or answer questions either through the Q&A or just through the webinar process here. So if you have questions or comments, please throw them in the Q&A if you have them for the panelists specifically or about the content. And I think we'll go ahead and get started. I want to make sure that we are respectful of everyone's time. So my name is Leah, and I'm really excited that you all are here today joining us for a deeper look into the conversation that we want to have today. So we're going to be talking about specialized and disability-focused forensic interviews as an ADA accommodation. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. But first, before we go in, I'm sure you can guess, we're going to talk to our panelists for a quick moment just to do some introductions so everyone is aware. So again, my name is Leah. I'm the Deputy Director with the Adult Advocacy Centers. And I think one thing that we're going to chat with you right now about individually is just why this concept and why this topic is so important to all of us. Not only is it important to our survivors, but it's also important to us individually in the work that we do. So I used to be in a previous life, I used to be a CAC director. And so I had experience with seeing kiddos, right, child survivors, coming to the CAC and getting services. And in that work, really seeing where people with disabilities didn't have the same access to the services. Many times in the CAC that I was affiliated with, the community worked really hard to make sure that kiddos with disabilities received the services. But what we found is that they needed the services in a different way. And really what was needed was accommodation. So I'm personally really excited to see this new concept come forward just as a whole in the criminal justice system for survivors to have the ability to really access victim services, maybe for the first time. So I'm going to throw it over to Catherine for her to introduce herself.
Hello, my name is Catherine Yoder. I'm the Executive Director of the Adult Advocacy Centers. Just a little bit of background. My entire career has involved investigating crimes against people with disabilities, from babies all the way up to into life, both in community and facility settings. And the one thing that has always been a really big issue that I have found in working with law enforcement and prosecutors is that a lot of times when cases occur, people with disabilities aren't even interviewed. If there's witnesses and they have disabilities, they aren't usually treated in the same manner as a witness without a disability. A lot of times they're just assumed there's not going to be credible information, particularly if that person has been labeled nonverbal or doesn't communicate traditionally through a spoken manner. And so understanding that gap and being able to actually do this work on forensic interviewing for people with disabilities has been really, really rewarding, because I've been in the other side where a lot of times I've had to explain to survivors, that we're really sorry that, unfortunately, there isn't that evidence for this to go forward. And I have been the one that, has set up the what piecemeal aftercare services could be put together. But this is very, very personal for many of us, because this is actually a step towards equity for people of disabilities of all ages to have a little bit more equity in even accessing the criminal justice and victim service arenas. And it also really comes down to dignity and value. This is really allowing people with disabilities to be present, to be involved in their own cases, and to actually be able to tell their stories themselves in whatever way they choose. And one thing that we say is that everyone's able to communicate. There are some people that we don't yet know how to receive that communication. And that does not mean that they don't know how to communicate. That means that we just don't have the skills or the knowledge yet to be able to receive that information. So we're very excited about this presentation today. And I will let Adana Wilson-Bainey, who does the majority of our forensic interviews, tell you a little bit about herself as well. Adana.
Thanks, Catherine. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for logging in. So a little bit about me. I started my career many, many years ago as a case manager and investigative agent for a county board of developmental disabilities. And after that, I worked for the state's protection and advocacy agency. I supervised the abuse neglect unit. After 31 years of state service, I came to work for the adult advocacy centers. And as Catherine mentioned, I conduct forensic interviews, and I also do some training and outreach. So I've been conducting investigations involving survivors with disabilities for over 31 years and conducting specialized forensic interviews for approximately 4 years. I've been forensically trained by the National Child Advocacy Center, Finding Words, and Project Find, including basic, advanced, and adapted. And I also attended FEDI training. And prior to working for the adult advocacy centers, I was frustrated by the absence of a protocol to support communication, to have that communication for all survivors with disabilities. And I just felt information was really slipping through the cracks. So I wanted to provide an example of my concern by just sharing a quick story. Many, many years ago, I was at a large facility, and a person living at the facility grabbed my hand and pulled me aside, and she placed her shoes in my hand, and she sat down and put her feet out in front of her. And so I put on her shoes, and after I tied the last bow, she quickly grabbed my hand and swiftly walked us towards the door. So I obviously understood she wanted out, she wanted to leave, but I didn't know why. I had no skills at that time to understand what she was trying to tell me. And I was very frustrated, and I was heartbroken to leave her there. She didn't use spoken words, and I didn't have the skills then that I have now. And I still think of her. So I really appreciate the time that all of you have taken out of your busy schedules to log in and to listen to this presentation. And with that, I'll pass the baton on to Rose. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Rose. I'm with Deaf World Against Violence Everywhere. We are a statewide organization agency that provides services for deaf, deafblind, hard of hearing, deaf diverse, and deaf disabled people within Ohio in the domestic violence and sexual assault world. Within the deaf population, I've been working in this field for about 11 years now. I've been with DeWave for 8 as well. And I've taken some trainings with the AAC, and I am also a forensic interviewer as well. So this is an important task, because we have seen that the deaf individuals who go to court, most of those cases get thrown out because they haven't followed the protocol, they haven't gotten enough information, they haven't gotten enough evidence, because police and detectives are hesitant and they don't know how to work with deaf individuals, and maybe even the advocates as well. So a lot of times those deaf individuals don't receive the justice they deserve. So this cause is very important to me. And now I will go ahead and pass it off to Sarah.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me today. I apologize, I was a few minutes late, but I am an assistant prosecuting attorney at Fairfield County Prosecutor's Office, which is located in Ohio. And the city that we're located in is Lancaster. We're about 45 minutes outside of Columbus. I began my career as a prosecutor in Franklin County in Columbus. I then worked as a defense attorney for some time. And then I worked at Disability Rights Ohio. And in that organization, my role was a victim's attorney. So I represented victims with disabilities in mostly criminal cases. So they were a victim in, well, I guess not, there wasn't always a case, but they had been a victim of a crime. And I would work with them to make sure that their rights were being afforded to them. And it was difficult to say the least. And I also, in that, as well as being a defense attorney, I traveled around the state of Ohio, and everything is just so completely different wherever you go. So, you know, I would notice some places were much more open to suggestions about what could be a reasonable accommodation, and already had some things laid out that would be helpful for persons with disabilities that were victims of crime. And then you would go to other counties and it would be just completely foreign. And a lot of the language used was also concerning, just to be honest. But I'm currently, again, back to prosecuting cases, and I'm glad to be a part of the presentation today. I also feel this is very important, and I sort of come from a different sort of, I guess, looking at it through a different lens, because I'm familiar with what, you know, at least in Ohio, what the laws are surrounding this area and what we can and can't do. And I think that obviously this, the AACs is just groundbreaking and is a great program to assist me and my colleagues in what we do. So thank you. I will turn it over to Laura.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Laura Kaiser. I am the Executive Director of Forensic Nursing Network. We are a statewide organization that works with sexual assault forensic programs to not only provide education, but also to provide support. I make myself available 24/7 to all of the programs around the state. And one of the biggest calls that I receive is I have a patient that's here at the hospital that was assaulted, and they do not speak. And I am not sure how I am going to communicate with this patient. What do I do? So a few years ago, I met Catherine with Adult Advocacy Centers, and you know, having worked with our child advocacy centers and providing care myself for all these years, I really found the value in working with forensic interviewers, and being able to provide that as a resource has really been an eye-opener for our programs around the state of Ohio. And, you know, having disabilities myself, I recognize the importance of having somebody that is available to be able to support, you know, people through processes, and having a forensic interviewer is really key for me as a forensic nurse in the care that I provide to patients with disabilities. So I'm really grateful to be here today, and looking forward to sharing with everyone.
Thank you so much. We are so grateful to all of our presenters and taking time out of their schedules to bring this important message to you all today. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to give you a short little elevator speech about the AACs and what we do. So we are a disability led national organization piloting a lot of our work here in Ohio. Our mission is to work within the disability, victim service, and criminal justice systems to improve access and equity for adult crime victims with disabilities, and to educate and train professionals within these systems on the unique needs of survivors with disabilities. So our vision is to serve adults with disabilities who are alleged victims and witnesses of abuse, neglect, or exploitation. So today, as we dive deeper into our information, this is kind of what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be giving you some data and statistics around crimes committed against people with disabilities. It's important to understand at what rate these things are happening and why it's so prevalent. We're also going to go over the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, talking specifically around the requirements around the forensic interview. We're going to talk about forensic interviews, and then we're going to touch a little bit more on specialized and disability focused forensic interviewing, and then wrap up with some information that you can hopefully take away from today with about trainings and some other resources that we do have available for free. So I'm going to go ahead and move us right on and pass it on to Catherine.
Thanks, Leah. So a little bit, it's important when we're trying to figure out where we're going to understand where we came from. And so just a little bit of background as far as why this is important. People with disabilities are victimized at a rate of 4 times more than people without disabilities. And that statistic varies because it's not completely accurate. Most experts in the field believe it's probably much higher. But even at 4 times higher than people without disabilities, that's an appalling statistic. And then people with disabilities were victims of 26% of all non-fatal violent crime, while accounting for only 12% of the total population. Again, these statistics need to be put into the context that the Department of Justice underestimates disability-related victimization rates because it does not include the data of people living in institutions and facilities. So that would definitely make a pretty big change to some of these statistics if that information was included. Next slide, please. In addition, when crimes are occurred, so we know that they happen at a rate much higher than pretty much any other population, and the prosecution rates very, very low if prosecution occurs at all. 47% of crimes against people with disabilities are reported to police. Out of that, 22% of alleged offenders are criminally charged. And out of that, only 9% of offenders are convicted. So when you put all of those numbers and things together, what it does is really paint a very, very clear picture that this is an epidemic. This is a very, very high rate of victimization that has been ongoing since data has been first collected in the 80s. And this is something that the rates have only gone up. And so that's part of the reason why we're very, very excited to discuss this forensic interview piece. Again, this is not a solution, but it is a tool, it is a step, and it is something that can be utilized to start changing some of these numbers and hopefully to inspire some other organizations to make victimization against people with disabilities one of their priorities. Most of the time in the disability community, we have our pillars that we focus on: employment, transportation, community integration, education. I know I'm forgetting one. And so while we're doing that work, which is very, very important, this victimization, the high rate of crimes against people with disabilities, needs to be part of everyone's agenda. Part of what we feel is kind of one of the contributing factors to a lot of the statistics is that you have not had the representation of people with disabilities in these fields at the same rate as we're present in many other fields. And that's a very, very important piece to keep in mind. This presentation that we're doing, these forensic interview protocols, these were created by people with disabilities for the disability community, and we do this work with our community. That's important because there's a cultural element to this work. People with disabilities come from a community, but disability is also a cultural community. And as a result, with any other cultural community, it is important to have that representation. It is important for that leadership and for that expertise to come from within the community, because obviously no one's going to understand the disability community quite like those of us that are part of the community. Next slide, please. And I'll pass this off to Sarah.
Hi again, everyone. I'm going to talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is commonly known as the ADA. I think most people, when they hear ADA, they know what we're talking about. And this was a bill that was passed in 1990. It protects people with disabilities from discrimination and affords them civil rights. Now, there was a Civil Rights Act of 1964, and that prevented discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. And obviously, disability was not included in there. And it took almost 30 more years to get disabilities included. And this was done by the ADA. The ADA defines a person with a disability as a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. And this can include somebody that has a record of such impairment, but does not currently have the disability. And let's see, next slide, please. There are different types of disabilities. I think generally the average population typically thinks of physical disabilities first, or that I don't know if that's general population or just my field, the legal world, but so physical disabilities, there are some examples on the slides here: traumatic brain injuries, and developmental disabilities are like the examples say, cerebral palsy, autism, Down syndrome, spina bifida, and these are there are several criteria. It's a physical or mental impairment, onset before the age of 22. It's likely to continue indefinitely, and the person has a substantial functional limitation in 3 major life activities. Our state, Ohio, has a specific definition in its code. So your state might as well. Intellectual disabilities characterized also originate before the age of 22, significant limitations in intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior, and then mental illness with some examples on the slide there. And I think that mental illness sometimes is sort of the last thing that comes to mind. I would say especially in my field, but in general, I think that individuals are not thinking that people with mental illness fall under the ADA and would need special accommodations, but they do. Next slide, please. So there's 5 titles in the ADA, and the one that we are concerned with and that is most important to the work done by the AACs and all of our panelists is Title II. So Title II is that the government, state and local governments cannot discriminate on the basis of disability. And a lot of state and government entities may say, well, I mean, of course we don't do that. Of course we're not discriminating against people with disabilities, but you do have to look into a little bit further and make sure that everything is accessible. So, which we talk about on the next slide. it talks about how the Title II of the AD talks about how there should be equal access to the criminal justice system specifically. So it's not just that outright discrimination as you might typically, a layman might typically think of the word, but it includes equal access. So if something's not available to a person with a disability, then it is discrimination against that person. The access starts at the beginning of the process. So it says the criminal justice system, and this covers the entire process. So this, I mean, really attaches when the crime occurs, when that person reaches out to law enforcement, or whoever does reach out to law enforcement, the ADA attaches at that time, Title II, and those protections that come along with it attach. So giving individuals equal access also includes reasonable accommodations. So basically equal access is just saying everyone needs equal access. And how do we get equal access? By giving reasonable accommodations to each individual based on their needs, their personal individualized needs. One of those reasonable accommodations is effective communication. And I think historically, again, sort of the theme of my presentation from the last few slides is historically, this is thought of as, you know, we're going to make sure our buildings are accessible. So we're going to have a ramp that makes it accessible for individuals with physical limitations. Courts will have assistance for individuals who are hard of hearing. But it really gets lost when we're talking about individuals with developmental disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and mental illness. Not that it's a perfect system for people with physical disabilities, but just when state and local governments typically, you know, read this and say, oh, we're going to follow the ADA, those disabilities don't necessarily come to mind right away. Next slide. So I guess I sort of dipped into this. Basically, Title II requires reasonable modifications be made to practices and procedures so that people with disabilities are able to communicate effectively with state and local governments. And specifically, we're talking about victims here, although it does apply to anyone in the process, defendants as well. But for purposes of today's presentation, we're talking about victims of crime. And basically, one of the reasonable modifications or accommodations is a specialized disability-focused forensic interview for crime victims with disabilities. So we generally, I believe it's sort of, it is a national model for child advocacy centers. And that was created because there was a need for children who are victims of abuse, physical or sexual or other crimes, to speak to someone who has specialized training other than a typical detective or law enforcement officer. And here we're basically just saying that this need is also there for individuals and victims who have disabilities, and that a forensic interview of this type qualifies as a reasonable accommodation under Title II, and that it is directly related to communicating effectively with individuals so that they can have equal access to the service, which in this case would be the prosecution of their of the crime. And obviously not every crime gets prosecuted for many reasons, but at least the reason is not because the person has a disability. so we can put them on an equal front, and ensure that they at least have an equal opportunity to have their statement heard, and get out the facts of what happened. Next slide, please. So the idea is that if a person with a disability has been a victim of a crime, they can contact law enforcement and request this specialized disability focused forensic interview. Obviously, this is what the AACs are doing, and they have the resources that can link the victims with these interviewers. The important thing to, I think, to remember is it's going to be incumbent on law enforcement to have this under their belt, to have this tool in their toolkit, and to realize when they get a call, you know, this person may benefit from a specialized disability focused forensic interview. You can always ask the person, but the person, you know, a person who's a victim of a crime may not know that this exists and may not know that it's a reasonable accommodation. And honestly, the state and local governments should be offering this. It shouldn't be on the victim to make this request, but that is often the case. So that being said, a lot of the time, especially in my experience, these law enforcement officers will notice, you know, maybe it's not best for me to interview this person, but I'm going to send them to the Child Advocacy Center. And that's not a reasonable accommodation because it's not reasonable to think that someone who's trained in interviewing children would also be trained in interviewing a person with a disability. It's just absolutely not synonymous. I've done the finding words training. And of course it's a great training, but it's just absolutely not the same thing to apply those practices and that model when you're speaking with someone who has a disability, and disabilities are, as well as communication styles, are just very individualized, and you can't just use a model that was developed for children. So that's often what we see law enforcement do. And so if the person is aware and can make this request, that's great. Or whoever's around them, case managers, friends and family. And then if that request is denied, there's certain actions that you can take. You can first contact your the protection and advocacy agency in your state, and they're able to give all of their legal advice is free, and they can at least point you in the right direction. If they can't take on the matter themselves, they can get you where you need to go. So it's definitely a good place to start. A formal ADA complaint can also be filed. And they're on the slides, the websites are listed. So these are just different options that can be taken. Next slide, please. And then you can also go to the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division and look for information and technical assistance. And then finally, contact the adult advocacy centers. So it, you know, the gold standard would be that law enforcement or members of the community or a multidisciplinary team would have this accommodation ready to go when needed. But if that's not possible, then the victim can request that accommodation, and then if denied, again, go through those different options of how to follow up. And the Department of Justice is the entity that enforces the ADA. So they also have, I think, excuse me, they also have information on their website as well. That is all for my part of the presentation, and I apologize, I don't know who's next, but I will turn it over to that person. Thank you.
It's me, Sarah. And I just have one quick follow-up question because we've had this question posed.
Yeah.
Is there a list of accommodations that the DOJ gives out that says that these are approved accommodations? Or is it something that's individualized based upon the case, and the goal is to meet those qualifications and all accommodations? Like, for example, I have a disability, but if I were to request an ASL interpreter, I would not be provided with one because that's not a reasonable request. That's not how I communicate. Could you just speak a little bit to that, Sarah, please?
Yeah, I think what you're saying is on point. So there does have to be a nexus. It's got to be a reasonable accommodation. And part of that is the person themselves knows what they best need, but again, it has to be reasonable. It's not reasonable for someone who is saying that they need a site accommodation to see better, that they would need a ramp just to get in the courtroom for some reason. I mean, now that I say that, I can see where maybe that'd be helpful, but there's got to be a nexus between the request that you're making. And it also does have to be reasonable for the state and local government. So if it's going to cost, I don't have a number, but if it's going to cost like $100,000, they may say that that's not reasonable. I don't necessarily know what that, would be, but it does have to be reasonable for the entity to provide it. And there's a nexus between that it will specifically assist in the process. So it will aid that person in becoming a part of the process and in an equal way that someone without a disability would be able to do. I think if that answers.
It does. Thank you very, very much.
No problem.
And I'm going to speak a little bit about the history of forensic interviews, but just to in Sarah's section, a big question is cost. Who covers the cost? And if this is a victim service request and accommodation, this is something that based upon VOCA's requirements that it would fall under an ADA accommodation, and that the cost could be covered in that way. Most entities, most state governments are going to have money put in their budgets for ADA accommodations, and this would fall under that. A big question that we will hear is, there aren't enough people who are trained in this. So if somebody is requesting a forensic interview and we don't have a forensic interviewer who specializes in disabilities, again, we'll get into this later in the presentation, but our organization has MOUs with different agencies and organizations throughout the nations. We do courtesy forensic interviews in other states, and we have 3-year MOUs that we offer too, just as kind of a safety net. And for those more complex cases, there are going to be cases where they are so complex, there's a high level of expertise that's needed, and that may be something to consider. So we'll speak now about the history of forensic interviews. In the 80s, child abuse investigators came under severe scrutiny. There was a ton of media attention due to some really high profile cases involving allegations of sexual abuse at child care centers. The interviews that came out of these cases with the child survivors were highly suggestive and got, there was a lot of discussion that occurred. So as a result, what people were able to see from these interviews is that the interviews were being done in a way that the children were praised for certain answers. There were promises made. There were positive reinforcement. The interviewers expressed approval and disagreement or disapproval, conformity pressure, and then also invited speculation about supposed events. Next slide, please. So as a result, there were some very strong child advocacy groups and people who came up and pioneered forensic interviewing. And essentially forensic interviewing, it's not a developmental type of interviewing. It is a narrative type of interviewing. And so therefore it is not something that can only be used with children. The issue is that forensic interviews, when they were developed, when the whole concept was developed, it was done in the realm of children, particularly sexual abuse. And as a result of that, it grew to this national phenomenon that we have here in the United States. But it could be adapted to other populations. The difference is that it just wasn't. And so forensic interviewing itself really is about that narrative interview technique. The goal is for the survivor to be able to tell their own story. Obviously, you know, firsthand accounts are the best. They're the most compelling, and they're the most useful as far as evidence. Forensic interviews need to be conducted by a trained professional. Currently, forensic interviewers are not certified. That is not something that is done in child advocacy centers. There's been a lot of discussion on both sides of that over the years. But we are focusing primarily on adults. We do a ton of courtesy forensic interviews for kids, but our focus is mainly on adults. And as a result of that, we are going to certify our training so that our forensic interviewers actually will have a certificate or some manner in which to state, yes, I have gone through the specialized training and I am specialized and I have the background and the knowledge and the experience and the education to conduct these interviews. Part of the reason for that is especially forensic interviewing with adult is a new area. We want to make sure the people doing this work actually are capable of doing the work versus somebody who is, you know, just like, well, you know, I have a daughter who has autism, so therefore I can interview people with disabilities. No, this is really a very specialized, very, very nuanced field. And we want to kind of approach that with the type of respect that it deserves. And so we're going to be offering that certification piece. Forensic interviews, the point of it is to gather that information from that person. It's really a way of making sure that this information could be admissible in a court of law and that it is part of the chain of custody. Forensic interviews are going to be done in an environment that is confidential. There's privacy, and we get into this a little bit later, but there's also forensic interview techniques, and that is just utilizing these type of interview skills in order to more effectively communicate with people. And that is also a huge benefit as well. Next slide, please. I segued myself a little bit earlier. What is the difference between a forensic interview and forensic interview techniques? Again, forensic interviews must be conducted in a specific environment that ensures confidentiality, privacy, and trauma responsiveness. There's a multidisciplinary team that observes the interview. When we talk about multidisciplinary team, our multidisciplinary team would include disability-specific agencies. It would include a victim advocate. It would include law enforcement. It would include prosecutor. It would include primarily the forensic nurse. And so those are going to be the members of our multidisciplinary team. Essentially, the way we look at it, the leader of our multidisciplinary team is also going to be the survivor. The survivor is the focus, and all of the work kind of operates around that person. And again, law enforcement assures the integrity of the chain of custody. The whole point of this type of interview is really to make sure that evidence is going to be available to assist law enforcement and prosecutors in moving these cases forward. Forensic interview techniques, again, are using these skills to be able to more effectively communicate and interview people. And so we have a lot of detectives, particularly in law enforcement, who take our protocol trainings. They are obviously not trying to become forensic interviewers because that would be a conflict of interest. forensic interviewers have to be a non-biased entity. And so law enforcement already has a role, but they attend frequently our trainings because of that knowledge base and the ability to be able to effectively communicate better with people that they are interacting with. And this type of forensic interview technique is something that's actually very, very utilized, very, very important to be utilized by a variety of different types of careers. Next slide, please. So forensic interviews, when we are talking about forensic interviews, we're talking about utilizing a protocol. And we have a series of protocols that we will talk about later in the presentation. We also are working on additional protocols. So the nice thing about this area, the nice thing about disability is that the protocols that could be developed really are ongoing. You know, disability a lot of times is divided up into silos. And as a result of that, there isn't always a lot of cross disability work that's done. And there's definitely not a lot done in the fields of criminal justice and victim services. Once you start doing some cross disability work, you realize very, very quickly that sometimes things that work for one silo, one population, can be adapted to another silo and population. It's just looking at it from the right lens. So we service all types of disabilities under the ADA. We also service all victimizations. So for the forensic interview protocol, the way that it's essentially set up is that there's an introduction, there's an engagement and sequential narrative, which is also part of that rapport piece. Forensic interview guidelines, a don't guess if you don't understand, you know, we create a baseline to make sure that people are able to answer specific questions and to be able to showcase the way in which they communicate. And some of those questions, again, would fall under don't guess, don't understand, provide correction, and promise to tell the truth. Transition to the topic of concern, then you get to the topic of concern. A lot of times during forensic interviews, there'll be a break, and whether that is initiated by the survivor, because a lot of times people need breaks, or if that's initiated by the forensic interviewer, a lot of times that interview will have a break in order to speak to the rest of the multidisciplinary team to make sure that there wasn't anything that was missed or any additional clarification that's needed. And then there's a trauma-informed closure piece at the end. The other piece is that victim services, a victim advocate is obviously available after that. Forensic interviews and victim advocacy is something that the survivor would need to agree to. That is not something that is going to be done without their consent. So again, we are very much survivor-led. Next slide, please. For forensic interviews, we need that consent. We get a lot of questions as far as, well, what happens if there's a guardian involved? And although people have a lot of feelings on both sides about the guardian, this is actually very cut and dry. The answer is that if there is a guardian involved, yes, we would need that guardian's consent. But if the individual, the survivor, does not want to engage in a forensic interview, we will not offer a forensic interview. It is up to that individual. We have on our website a very comprehensive resource that's available for consent. And we had a guardianship agency, and actually Laura, who is on this call, the executive director of the Forensic Nursing Network, she was involved in creating this informed consent guidebook. It is about a 33-page guidebook, very, very comprehensive. I strongly suggest looking at it if that's something you're interested in. For those of us who have had informed consent cases, they usually end up getting muddled very, very quickly. And that was part of the reason why this is so comprehensive, is because we've run into problems with these cases ourselves. So it is an excellent resource, but that consent piece, that is something that we must have consent from the survivor. We do have MOUs We currently have ongoing MOUs. We have one here in Ohio with the 3-year with the Ohio Attorney General's Office, their Special Victims Unit, the Ohio State Highway Patrol here in Ohio. The Highway Patrol is the one that's in charge of investigating the state-run facilities, county, local law enforcement. And then again, all forensic interviews must be conducted in safe and confidential settings and must be video and audio recorded because they may be used as evidence. The other piece to kind of keep in mind is that when that is being video and audio recorded, it's done in such a way that the whole room is on the video and on audio, and that video is never to be paused. It's supposed to run the entire time during the interview. One other element that I would just like to throw in there is that our forensic interviews may take longer than what a traditional child forensic interviewer may take. We may do multi-session, and again, it may take, a while to build rapport. We just, again, are led by the survivor. Next slide, please. And when we had spoken about forensic interviews, we spoke about the multidisciplinary team. This is a list of the individuals that would be part of our multidisciplinary team. It should be very, very similar to multidisciplinary teams within child advocacy centers. I know that as a whole, some child advocacy centers have disability agencies involved as part of the MDT. Some don't, depending on the CAC. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind. Ours will. And so next slide, please. And now I'll turn it over to Adana.
Thanks, Catherine. So we'll talk about forensic interviews and some needed adaptations. So although victim interviews have improved through time, a lot of the protocols that have been used to interview children, a lot of those are very similar. So it started off a little different, and now they've all kind of convened on a similar process.
Excuse me, Adana, would you mind speaking a little bit louder? It's a little bit difficult to hear you.
Sure, I'm going to turn up my volume and see if that helps.
That's a little bit better. Thank you.
Sure. So the problem is forensic interviewers typically are not trained to provide or recognize the need for accommodations or accessibility required by crime victims with disabilities. And as Sarah and Catherine discussed, the provision of accessibility and needed accommodations can include a specialized and disability-focused forensic interview. Next slide, please. So as Sarah talked about the Title II of the ADA, which requires that criminal justice entities avoid discriminating against people with disabilities and requires equal access to the criminal justice system. A specialized and disability-focused forensic interview avoids discrimination and provides this equal access through accessibility and accommodations. So some benefits of a specialized forensic interviewer. They've had additional training and education in the fields of specific disability types. So again, intellectual disabilities, developmental disabilities, mental health diagnoses, and physical disabilities. And they've had experience conducting interviews in both community and facility settings. So that would include nursing homes, adult care facilities, ICFs, and group home and other congregate settings. And specific training to understand cultural and trauma nuances, and education and training to adapt for communication needs and the use of auxiliary aids and other communication methods. So requesting a forensic interview. So if a person has a disability as defined by the ADA, and as Sarah discussed, that definition is very, very broad and has an open case with law enforcement may receive a request for this type of specialized forensic interview. So what are some of the benefits of a specialized forensic interview? And we'll list these bullet points and we'll talk about them in greater detail. Trauma-informed, provision of accessibility and accommodations, can reduce re-victimization. They may elicit additional details, provide a pathway to justice and increase the likelihood of criminal charges, dispel myths and stereotypes of crime victims with disabilities, may reduce future non-reporting of crimes committed against individuals with disabilities. So trauma-informed, the phrasing and question types will avoid victim blaming. So a specialized forensic interviewer would never say, why didn't you tell somebody? Why didn't you leave? Why didn't you make it stop? Those would never be questions that a specialized forensic interviewer would pose to a survivor. It includes rapport building and an extended rapport building time to allow the individual being interviewed to feel comfortable and safe. So allowing that acclimation time and that time to feel more comfortable. The person being interviewed is leading the conversation. The specialized forensic interview is just providing those accommodations, accessibility, and the support needed so the person can tell their story, can tell what happened to them.
Adana, people are still having some difficulty hearing you. If you could try to speak a little bit louder, that would be helpful.
Sure, I'm so sorry. I'm going to move my computer closer to me. Does that help at all?
Yep,
Okay,
thank you.
thank you. So the provision of accessibility and accommodations, this supports crime victims with disabilities, and it creates a space for disclosure. It's responsive to an individual's need. So accessibility ensures physical and service accessibility, which allows crime victims with disabilities to fully participate in a specialized forensic interview. So some examples of physical accessibilities, and this is not a complete list, includes exterior ramps, accessible restrooms, and even floor surfaces. Some examples of service accessibility includes the provision of an interpreter, providing writing materials during a specialized forensic interview, and the use of plain language. So accommodations are adjustments to some aspect of a process or system to eliminate or reduce barriers. And these can include physical and service accommodations. Some examples of physical accommodations include ensuring that preferred seating. So a survivor may need to sit towards the door rather than away from the door to feel safe and more comfortable. A person may need low lighting, and that a person may have migraines, and lighting may trigger that migraine. Modifying the layout of an interview room, and this could include removing or moving furniture so someone that uses a wheelchair can comfortably enter a forensic interview room and sit across from the forensic interview. Service accommodations include, but aren't limited to, providing additional breaks, minimizing environmental noise, and the use of communication boards and other auxiliary communication aids. So one of the other benefits of a specialized forensic interview is reducing victimization by limiting the number of times a survivor is interviewed. So by implementing a disability-specific protocol, audio and video recording the interview, and having the multidisciplinary team observing the forensic interview in an adjacent room, this can assist in not having the person being made to tell their story 5 different times to 5 different people. So really connected to that trauma-informed process and protocol that we use. So a specialized forensic interview may elicit additional details. Because the protocols used during a specialized forensic interview supports crime victims with disabilities, they're more able to report the full details of the incident. So as Catherine mentioned, forensic interviews may, specialized forensic interviews may take longer. I've had forensic interviews last, 3.5 hours, and that process can include additional perpetrators that law enforcement was unaware of, different sites where the crime occurred, and different environmental or other types of details. For example, that the individual was in a room that had no plumbing, and those are all new details that law enforcement were unaware of. Just by using the specialized forensic interview protocol that just supports the person being able to tell their story. Provides a pathway to equitable justice. So for crime victims with disabilities, isolation, limited services, and a lack of accommodations all can contribute to a belief that there's no hope of achieving justice. So strategies such as providing a specialized forensic interview can instill empowerment and hope. So we have a quote from a publication that the ARC had for 2014. And the survivor said, they talked to my caseworker. They talked to people at the nursing agency. They talked to my son. And I thought that was kind of invasive for someone who was the victim. So talking to everyone else but the person with a disability, the crime victim, the survivor. So that is the opposite of what a specialized forensic interviewer would do. The survivor with a disability would be the focus in providing the necessary supports, the accessibility and accommodations that the person needs. So I'm going to turn the presentation over to Rose, and I want to thank everybody again.
All right, hello. So we are going to go ahead and talk about the deaf and disabled culture. So some of you might be, thinking, oh, that's really unfortunate, but really disability is a culture. So, oh, they're missing out on life. They can't hear music. The deaf people can't hear music. But if a person was born deaf, they don't know that they're missing out on those sounds. And the reality is that deaf community has a culture. It has a culture of its own. It has a rich history. We have musicians and artists. And so all of that makes up the culture. So just as disability has a culture, the deaf world has a culture as well. We understand each other. We can communicate with each other, and we typically believe each other more than others. So in the past, we have been oppressed and we've experienced all of those different types of discrimination. And reason being is because we hesitate to go to the police. If we file a report, what happens? And so if we go to follow up and ask what's happening, they'll be like, oh, sorry, there's not enough evidence. And many years of that has been a result of we just accept that treatment. If an interpreter shows up and they're not necessarily qualified, the deaf community might think, well, having a lousy interpreter is better than not having anything. And so when working with the survivors, when a person comes for a forensic interview, you need to make sure that you provide those accommodations. However, that person themselves might not know their rights, and they'll be willing to accept the things that aren't right just because they're not aware of the accommodations that should be provided for them. That's the reason that I, as a deaf woman, decided to become a forensic interviewer, because as a deaf woman myself, if I am interviewing a person who is deaf, we have that common connection. There's not any type of judgment or power imbalances. But I can notice, in addition, I can notice small nuances. I can pick up on small body language features that a person who isn't deaf might not catch. I can ask the person to expand. Oh, I see that has caused some sort of reaction to your body. I've noticed a physical reaction. Do you mind expanding on that? And so having a forensic interviewer and providing an interpreter is great. However, within the interpretation, English and ASL are completely different languages with completely different foundations. And so it's difficult to provide an accurate interpretation because the structure and the grammatical structures are different. In English, you might say, I go to the store. But in ASL, you would say, the store I go to. So it's completely different setup of the sentence structure. So maybe the forensic interviewer has asked a question, but the interpreter accidentally led the survivor to provide an answer. It wasn't intentional, but that might have happened. So with a forensic interviewer that is deaf and knows the language and can speak directly to the survivor, there are less times when miscommunication can happen. Can you go to the next slide, please? So as I was saying, ASL has many different nuances. We have different accents. Maybe you have a deaf person who is from a different country. They were born in a different country and then they came here. They use a completely different mode of sign language and maybe they don't know ASL. A lot of deaf people can often use home signs. And so we have their deaf interpreters, either certified deaf interpreters or deaf interpreters. Certified obviously means they went through a training program and got certified. But a deaf interpreter has had some training, but hasn't yet been certified. But the really big impact and difference with that is that a deaf person has grown up with the culture, with the cultural backgrounds and nuances. And a hearing interpreter has gone through the training and is able to assist. They're able to become teams. And so a hearing interpreter can pick up the auditory language, the English, translate it to ASL. And then a deaf interpreter will take that ASL and then further code switch and be able to apply and accommodate the nuances of the person that might need that extra specialized language. There's different, ASL is on a spectrum. And so you have somebody who's fully ASL, and then you might have somebody who's more signed exact English. And then in the middle, you have what's called pigeon sign language, pigeon sign English, but sign exact English is more word for word. So within that team, you've had people that have already been trained and specialized in those different, in the different range and able to further accommodate those survivors. And that's why it's really important to have the deaf interpreter, because they're able to code switch and really further accommodate those people. By incorporating a forensic interviewer who is trained and specialized in the language and who might be deaf themselves, you are able to lessen the trauma for that survivor. You don't want to re-traumatize the person because they might not feel confident with the interpreter. They might have to tell their story again. And sometimes if there's miscommunications from the interpreter or otherwise, when they go to court and the stories don't match, then that case can be thrown out. And so providing that accommodation is key. And it takes money, it takes time. And especially with a deaf and hearing interpreter team, that time, as many people mentioned with the forensic interview, is lengthened and it takes more time. Adana mentioned the lighting in the room, providing accommodations. Same thing with the deaf community. The deaf survivor might prefer a specific place to sit. You obviously have to think about sight line and being able to see the person. You have to think about where lighting can be shown on the person's face versus behind them, creating shadows. So really working as a full team, setting up a plan for an effective space for those accommodations to be provided. It's more than just, oh yeah, we'll provide an interpreter. Like it's much more, you need to think about many more things than that. And especially with interpreters, they need to be trained in forensic interviewing because again, that re-traumatization can happen from a simple miscommunication. And so we are, you want somebody who is a subject matter expert. You want somebody who's a cultural expert. And so maybe sometimes you will need to bring in props, bring in photos to help with the interview. But again, all of those interviews are individualized and very based on the individual. And so providing an interpreter, it does satisfy the accommodation on a basic level, but there are many more things to think about. And I think, Catherine, did I mention everything that I needed to here?
Yes, perfect, Rose. The other piece, and Rose is being modest, to the best of our knowledge, Rose is currently the only ASL speaking forensic interviewer in the United States. I would like to point out it is 2023. Rose does not have some sort of superhero skills. We think you're wonderful, Rose, but there are prerequisites that are needed to become a forensic interviewer, and that is essentially of a background in investigations, that you've conducted interviews. We have all that requirement listed on our training section, but you have not necessarily seen people with disabilities in those roles, and we are more than capable of doing that type of work if we meet those type of prerequisites. Having someone to be able to speak to someone in their own language is the most trauma responsive way to conduct an interview. The other piece that I know we've run into in cases is that a lot of times the ASL interpreter that's brought in to assist with a forensic interviewer does not necessarily have any training on forensic interviewing. And as a result, the actual interpretation sometimes is not accurate. A lot of times additional words are added or rephrased or just, totally restated. So that has been an ongoing issue. So again, representation, when we're talking about representation, the majority of times when we have representation in the field of criminal justice or victim services, it's more in a secondary role people with disabilities have occupied. We are definitely taking that role and throwing it to the side, and people with disabilities belong in the secondary role. We also should be in the roles of the professionals offering these type of services and developing this type of work. I know I had a discussion with someone who said, well, not just anyone can become a forensic interviewer. Can you imagine what would happen if someone with autism was trying to conduct a forensic interview? And I said, yeah, actually, I've been doing it for about 25 years. So the other piece to keep in mind is there are already a ton of people with disabilities that are doing this work in the fields. This has not always been the most inclusive field to come out with a disability. A lot of times there's going to be a lot of stigma and discrimination that people face. I am an executive director of an organization. We've created the first series of forensic interview protocols for crime victims with disabilities, and I end up on calls with professionals. I was on a call with an attorney that asked if I was a regular autistic or if I was like Rain Man. Another call that I was on, it wasn't starting, and I asked what the delay was, and they said that they were waiting for my support person because they just assumed if I have a disability, I must have a support person. And some people with disabilities do, and some people don't. But there is a lot of stigma and discrimination within the field from professionals who have gone through specific training and should know better. And so these are some of the barriers and obstacles that we are facing as professionals in that field. I think it just should provide a little bit of an insight of what we may be subjecting our survivors to. Next slide, please. So the benefits of, I see Rose. Did you want to add something?
Yes, Rose. Yeah, I'd like to add something. And also something to keep in mind, Catherine, you had mentioned 47% of the crime reports of the people with disability crime reports is that only 9% are charged. And, and I see that in my work all the time when deaf individuals, they do report, but then nothing happens and just nothing comes from that. And it's because of this communication, and they think, you don't need an interpreter. And then it takes more time and that's not a trauma-informed response. That's not being having that equal justice. That's not having right accommodations and following the right procedures. And so then more people that are and it's just wanting and going towards that goal of having that equal accommodation and equal justice. And just keep in mind, of what is justice, and that to make sure that we are following these, and that every part of the process, we do have those accommodations, we're getting those interpreters, and maybe people are unsure I don't know how to properly accommodate, then ask the person themselves.
And we hear that a lot. People do have questions about accommodations, just about disability law. Just as, any type of topic, people have expertise in certain areas. They don't necessarily have expertise in all areas. And so we could potentially be a really good resource to reach out to if we don't have the answer. We definitely can put people in touch with the people who can answer it. And so that's really important to keep in mind. But I think the really big thing that we're paying attention to is that this isn't just a disability issue. Disability intersects into every single segment of the population. So this is really a global community issue. But we also have a very, very strong support from victim services, from people in the criminal justice who have the same frustrations as the disability community. So this is really a wonderful opportunity for cross collaboration, and to really kind of stand together as allies as we kind of work against these horrible statistics. Additional benefits of specialized forensic interviews is that, by having this specific training, by having this expertise, it can also help dispel myths and stereotypes about adult crime victims with disabilities. Some of the stereotypes that we have heard, and we actually have a guidebook on our website that's pretty amazing. It's called our Prosecutor's Guidebook. It goes through different case scenarios as far as why prosecutors have not been able to take certain cases forward, and provides case law and other ways to possibly make these cases move forward in the courts, and other kind of tools and ways to try to come at these cases. But what we hear a lot is people with disabilities don't make good victims. I don't know what a good victim is, but people with disabilities are just like anybody else. And you're going to have people who end up being victimized, who have histories, who maybe have made false allegations. All that really does is kind of raise their vulnerability to be potentially perpetrated against, because perpetrators obviously are going to be trying to seek out people that maybe will not be believed. And so I've heard once from a prosecutor, they said, I'd love to take this case forward. It's a good case. We just don't have a victim. And I said, well, what about little Johnny? And they said, well, little Johnny doesn't speak, so Johnny isn't a victim. And so even just some of the ways that we're talking, the language that we use, of course, Johnny would still be a victim. Anyone who has a crime perpetrated against them is a victim. And so you don't have to be able to speak or communicate in a traditional manner to be a good victim. And that goes back to the value and the dignity. If you've been victimized, you should be treated with the same respect, consideration, and empathy that's afforded to any other victim of a crime. Crime victims with disabilities won't know how to explain what happened to them on the stand. The statement really shouldn't be that crime victims with disabilities won't know how to explain what happened to them on the stand. The statement should be that the person requesting information or asking questions of the victim may not know how to ask the right questions. There are nuances when dealing with in the disability community. There are nuances between people who live in the community and people who live in facilities. And there's also a lot of nuances as far as, some people with disabilities are not exposed to sexual education. Some people with disabilities may fit the criteria of both a perpetrator and a victim. And so these are different things that really just require a little bit more education and information. People with disabilities don't really feel their victimization because they're disabled. I have worked in this field for a very, very long time, and I have yet to encounter someone who doesn't feel their victimization. I think that really comes down to victim blaming on the parts of other people. Just because you don't see it doesn't mean it's not there. And just because people don't respond or communicate in a way that you feel would align with that victimization doesn't mean that they're not affected. The other piece about it is when you deal with survivors with disabilities who have been victimized, a lot of times trauma is overlooked and the physical manifestation of trauma. A lot of times people with disabilities after being victimized will end up with a new diagnosis or will be put on additional medication because anything that comes out of that victimization is automatically attributed to their disability, and there isn't that same consideration for the trauma, which is huge. And that is, trauma work is something that we do quite a lot with the Adult Advocacy Center. Just a side note, we do offer a free training for mental health professionals who would like to have some additional kind of tools to provide trauma counseling for people with disabilities, particularly intellectual and developmental disabilities. And we offer that training through the University of Illinois in Chicago. That's on our website. Just a side note. Next slide, please. Some more myths. People with disabilities are often considered unreliable because they're not able to provide accurate information during a criminal investigation and do not have the ability or capacity to testify in court. I think that really kind of goes back within the whole need for forensic interviews. Having someone to gather this information who's actually trained to do so, to provide the best circumstances for this person to feel comfortable, to be able to disclose. And in some cases, there may not be a disclosure, but it is important for that survivor to have that opportunity and that respect and that ability to feel valued, like their story counts as well. These myths obviously devalue crime victims with disabilities. I just want to very quickly offer a story. We did a forensic interview a while ago in a rural area. The sheriff had called us and said, look, we have this case. This person is nonverbal. It's a sexual assault. We can't interview this victim, but we know who the perpetrator is and we're going to move ahead with the case. They said, if you want to come do the interview, that'd be great. But we feel pretty confident about, already identifying the perpetrator. So we went down. Again, our interviews end up being a little bit longer. It took about 3 hours. And at the end of that interview, this individual who had been labeled as nonverbal ended up being able to provide details about the case, which is great. But the really cool thing is this individual was able to identify the correct perpetrator. The person that law enforcement had identified as the perpetrator was not the correct perpetrator. The actual perpetrator ended up being a staff person, and it was actually the staff person who submitted the incident report. And because the survivor was nonverbal, they anticipated that they would never get caught. And police were able to corroborate that, and it's headed towards a grand jury. That's an excellent case that really kind of showcases that if a forensic interview had not occurred, that case outcome would have been very, very different. It's also an excellent case that showcases here's someone who had been discounted, someone who there were assumptions this person wouldn't be able to really offer anything new or any useful information, and this person actually ended up making the case. And so those are things to kind of keep in mind. A lot of times, we have expectations in our heads based upon what we read about people. And a lot of times that information may not actually be what they are capable of doing. And so it's one of those things where you really need to sit down and take the time to interact with that person and find out yourself. Adults with disabilities have vastly different lifestyles and experiences compared to most children. Adults are not children. That's not a fact that anyone will refute, but that the same applies to people with disabilities. Adults with disabilities, they may live independently, they may live in a group home, they may live in an institutional setting or someplace else. Many often work, have bank accounts, pay taxes, maybe in a romantic relationship, be married, have children, be divorced. So essentially, when we're talking about disability, it's such a huge spectrum, and it really can include all of us. When we talk about, again, who we service, we talk about the ADA definition of disabilities, and a lot of people forget that includes older adults with disabilities. So you have people with disabilities who obviously age, and then older adults who may acquire age-related disabilities. And so that's an important group to kind of keep in mind that often gets left out of the discussions. Next slide, please. Additional benefits are, reducing future non-reporting by empowering crime victims with disabilities. We're hearing from a lot of survivors that are very, very frustrated and defeated by the system, by reporting and making allegations that never actually go anywhere and no one's held accountable. And so a lot of people are discouraged and have kind of just decided not to utilize the criminal justice system. When we talked about our MOUs, we also can do cases where for people who maybe don't want to go the traditional route and have their cases interact primarily with law enforcement, we can have that MOU signed with a prosecutor. So there are ways to make some adaptations for that, because obviously our focus is doing what's best for the survivor and making them comfortable. Despite the prevalence of victimization among people with disabilities, more than half never, ever even seek assistance from law enforcement. Why? A lot of times is because they believe police won't help. There also is a compelling statistic from a survey that NBC News did, where 50% of all law enforcement shootings that end in death involve someone with disabilities. So you also have some people with disabilities that are fearful of the police. And so those are all things that I know on a local and national level, disability advocacy groups are doing a lot of work around. But there are a lot of historical issues that also factor in, such as there are still situations where if people make allegations of abuse and they don't redact them, people threaten them with institutionalization. And so those things continue to happen. So those are things to keep in mind. And then, of course, providing specialized forensic interviews empowers crime victims and survivors with disabilities. Sitting down, spending time with somebody, allowing them to tell the story. That is really a very cathartic type of process, but it also, like I said, it really drives in that foundational value and respect. Next slide, please. And now I think that is going to head over to Leah. If I could just say one last thing, Leah, a lot of times, especially disability specific agencies in the adult arena, they are not going to necessarily have forensic interview rooms. That's something that we're in the process of raising funds to create a center and some mobile units. The mobile units would house, excuse me, a forensic interview room and a forensic nurse examination room. And, the point of that would be to be able to be mobile, to obviously go to people, but also to be able to afford people who live in facilities the same ability to have these specialized interviews. A lot of times we utilize child advocacy centers. We have some wonderful relationships and are very, very grateful to the child advocacy centers that we've worked with, and that we're able to utilize their facilities and conduct forensic interviews out of those as well.
Yes, thank you. So we're going to just touch a little bit briefly about some of the services that we offer at the AACs. You all have been kind of hearing all about some of the different types of services, but we want to talk a little bit more specifically around what we can offer, I guess, if you will. So we're going to talk about forensic interviewing specifically, and then also some victim services. So the foundation of equitable justice really rests in the ability for a crime victim to report what happened to them, and for this information to be heard, believed, and then acted upon, right? So if you just take that idea and that concept, you really can drill down into understanding everything that we've talked about today, and everything and all the nuances of things, and the reasons why this type of accommodation needs to be utilized. So something that we kind of like to say, I don't know if we can call it an official slogan, but really, people with disabilities have always had a voice, and we're teaching the rest of the world how to listen. And it might be how to listen for the first time. So that is something that we always like to mention, and people can kind of put in their back pockets or in the back of their minds when they're thinking about this type of work and the type of accommodations an agency, specifically a victim service agency, would be able to provide when working with a crime victim with a disability. So you've heard us talk a lot about forensic interviewing, a lot about specialized forensic interviewing. What happens if you need training? What do you do? Where should you go? So we have a lot of different types of trainings available. Everything is accessed on our website, and I will show you the link to that in just a second. But we have specific disability focused forensic interviewing specific training. So if you look at our website, we have basic adult forensic interview protocol. So this protocol is for someone who maybe is new to the field of forensic interviewing. They don't have that basic training yet, but they need one, and maybe their role is focusing solely on adults. So again, this is a good training to get those original 32 to 40 hours of training in forensic interviewing. The next level of training that we offer is disability forensic interview protocol, and this is all under the ADEPT training umbrella that we have. So this is your training that's going to really drill down into understanding how to interview someone with a disability. So let's say you're a somewhat experienced forensic interviewer, you already have that basic training, but you want to get more specialized. You would jump into disability forensic interview protocol. And then we have two even further specialized training. So one is a forensic interview protocol for people with expressive communication disabilities. And so this is really working with individuals who communicate in a different way. And then we also offer forensic interview protocol for adult victims of neglect with disabilities. So this, again, is extremely specialized. The last two here listed would be for someone who has that disability forensic interview protocol, already has the basic, and then is looking to further their knowledge and education in working with the disability community. So here's the here's the link. I'll also try to put the link in the Q&A here when I get done, so that way everyone can have it. But if you just go to our website and go to our training tab, you'll be able to find all the different types of trainings that we offer, including the one that Catherine mentioned about trauma-informed care. So equal justice under the law is not merely a caption on the facade of the Supreme Court building, right? It is perhaps the most inspiring ideal of our society. It is one of the ends for which our entire legal system exists. I think this is extremely important. And like, I feel the more times I read it and think about it, it almost means something different. If you would have talked to me in my previous life, before victim service world, I would read this and be like, absolutely, I totally agree with that. And then take me in a CAC director role, and I would read this and my perspective would be different. And then now move me forward to 2023 and read this, and it means even more now to me as a advocate and as someone who is pushing this movement forward. It's it's very powerful. Words can be very powerful, as we all know. So resources, I told you all that we would talk about free resources that you can access today and some takeaways. So what can you do today? If you need training, get training. If you have questions, reach out to us. Any of our panelists are absolute experts and would love to have further conversations with you, especially if you have questions about specific cases or how to get training, things like that. We also have resources. So again, on our website, you can go under our resources tab, and there's a breakdown of what your areas that you might be looking for. And we have tons and tons of things. So they're all free. Please take advantage of that. A lot of times when we work with people, people are saying like, well, I'm trying to collect as much information as possible or as much knowledge so I can pass it on to my MDT or so I can have it for the future needs. And I think that's great. So anytime if you're building a toolkit or building your binder of information, please utilize the things that we've published. It's very helpful. So we have different types of information about forensic interviewing and victim advocacy services. We have, of course, information about who we are, what we do, you know, an overview of our agency, which can kind of be helpful. We've noticed that throughout the years that we've been doing this work, people generally understand who we are and what we do, but really need further explanation because work like this has not been done ever before for this population. And so it's really important for people to, if they want to learn about it, they want to know about us to have the correct information. So we have a prosecutor's guidebook as well online, as well as a jurist guide. These are thorough guidebooks. Many people have collaborated to make this happen. You know, we don't do this work in a silo. We understand that many people need to come to the table with many different viewpoints, expertise, opinions. So that way we can provide the best information and the best services to crime victims with disabilities. So there is just a teeny tiny bit of some of the resources. There's a lot of different things. I really encourage y'all to go check them out. I'm going to pass it over to Laura.
All right, thank you so much, Leah. So I do want to talk a little bit about forensic nurse examiners, who they are and what we do. So a forensic nurse examiner is a registered nurse who's received a minimum of 40 hours of specialized training to provide comprehensive care to patients that have experienced any type of intentional violence. This care really includes the not only the medical assessment, but also forensic evidence collection. And then we will use all of the information from our exam to participate as a witness in a courtroom process as well, which is something we're more than happy to do. When looking at the term forensic nurse examiner, many people are more familiar maybe with the term sexual assault nurse examiner or SANE. I really want to make sure to stress that really in the state of Ohio and nationally, more people are moving away from this term for the simple fact, if you have somebody that has maybe mental health issues, or maybe they're concrete thinkers and you're using the term SANE, this can sometimes be offensive. Oh, you're going to call a SANE nurse in? Are they going to assess rather my mental capacity? And if I'm telling the truth, what does that mean? So with sexual assault nurse examinations, it's really just a small part of forensic nursing. So you will begin to hear more and more people switch over to this term. You may still hear it some areas, but they are moving that over. Next slide, please. So I did want to provide you with some information on the types of education that's out there and resources. Forensic Nursing Network does collaborate with adult advocacy centers in providing that initial classroom training to our forensic nurses. They will also receive additional clinical training. It's also required. But typically, we follow the International Association of Forensic Nursing guidelines for education, which is really important. But one thing that we really notice is it doesn't provide a whole lot of education on caring for patients with disabilities. So we did have conversations with adult advocacy centers and really provide an extra entire day specifically on caring for patients that have disabilities. This is really important because it stresses on providing that trauma-informed, patient-centered care through a disability lens and allowing our patients with disabilities to fully participate in their exams and meet their accommodations. We will also be providing a one-day training, hopefully in the fall. We're anticipating, so we're pretty excited on for forensic nurses maybe that already have experience and how to care for those patients with disabilities. So be on the lookout for that. And then we're even hopeful in the future, in coming years, to be able to provide certification for our forensic nurses, specifically a course in caring for and receiving that certification for disabilities. So that's pretty exciting. The guidebook, I know that was mentioned a little bit earlier by Catherine. We did help to create a forensic nurse education guidebook that really helps provide that basic guidance when you are caring for patients with disabilities, because it's something that's not widely available to our nurses. We are also working on a national protocol. When we created the guidebook, we really felt we have to get this information out, but there's so much information that's needed. So with the national protocol, which we hope will be coming out soon, really focuses in on each of the different types of disabilities and considerations for forensic nurses when providing that care. And then finally, we are providing that supportive services. When I mentioned earlier, I make myself available 24/7. Nurses and programs will call me, and I'm not, it's perfectly fine, because if you need assistance, I will go back to sleep. I promise. I have narcolepsy. I will go back to sleep. But for those that need services, they need it now. So we make ourselves available to say, yes, we have wonderful resources. We talk about forensic interviewers and all of the different resources that are available for patients with disabilities. So we are always happy to provide that additional education and information to our forensic programs. I will turn this back over, I think,
To me.
Ah,
And just to piggyback on what Laura said, we are currently working with the Forensic Nursing Network to come up with a national protocol that focuses on service delivery to survivors with disabilities. This will be huge because there are so many different accommodations and adaptations that need to occur when you're dealing with specific disabilities. And so we're very, very excited about that collaboration that is ongoing. And we're hoping to have some information to share probably this fall around that particular area. One last thing, and we appreciate you all hanging in. I know we went over a little bit, and that is most likely my fault. We're very, very passionate about this work, and sometimes it's a little bit harder to stick to script when we think of additional things to share. But one last thing, we also are part of the National Disability Collaborative Justice Coalition. This is a new coalition that has been established this year that is brings together disability-led organizations in the fields of criminal justice, victim service, and advocacy. There are not a lot of disability-led organizations in these particular areas, and not every single disability-led organization is part of our National Disability Collaborative Justice Coalition. You can find us on Facebook. It also is a really, really wonderful place to interact with disability-led organizations that are doing this work that could be utilized as experts in certain areas, that also could be utilized for their trainings and things that are being offered. So it's just another way to kind of bring a little bit more exposure to disability-led organizations in this field. And really this coalition, our perspective of it is really to kind of be able to advocate in certain areas as one voice with the strength across disabilities. And we have a white paper that kind of explains the mission and the goals of the National Disability Collaborative Justice Coalition. The link's here, and it's also on that particular Facebook page. Next slide, please. And that concludes our discussion. Here's some of our contact information. Again, we are on Facebook. We do have the website. We have a phone number. We have email. If for some reason there's another way that you would prefer to be contacted, if you just allow us or give us that information, we will definitely accommodate. And we really appreciate you attending this presentation. This is a really innovative and groundbreaking field. This is making huge differences in the lives of people with disabilities, literally one case at a time. And so again, I want to just thank my fellow presenters for taking their time today to sit in and to offer their expertise, and to thank all of you for attending. And again, to thank Jeremy and the Ohio Sills for hosting. This has just been a really, really wonderful collaborative process, and we're very, very excited for the future. So thank you. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A in the chat, and we'll quickly try to answer them.
Yes, let's answer some questions here. And Catherine, do you want to mention about accepting stakeholders still?
Accepting what? I'm sorry.
Stakeholders into the signing
Yeah,
on.
so we are still accepting stakeholders until I think 8 o'clock tomorrow. If you hear barking in the background, that's my dogs. I would like to say they have been incredibly good during this presentation, which is not always the case. But we are accepting stakeholders to sign on to the white paper. The white paper, essentially, it's found on our website, or if you would like another copy, feel free to email us. The web paper clearly just states that forensic interviewing by a specialized forensic interviewer meets the qualifications and the criteria for an ADA accommodation. And depending on that person and their disability, they may qualify to request that. It just provides a lot more detailed information.
Great. We do have one question here in the Q&A. It says, would that training also be available to child abuse doctors? We do not have FNEs. However, our CAC doctors are all trained and also examining adolescents and adults with disabilities.
I know for myself, I would be happy to speak to anyone and everyone, physicians, nurses, whomever that might be, regarding the importance of using forensic interviewers.
Yeah, and I know we've gotten a lot of requests from the medical community about having a specialized training specifically for medical professionals. And I think that's something that if you're interested in collaborating, please reach out to us. That's something that we definitely have enough interest that that's something we can start kind of putting together. But we're always looking for different stakeholders, particularly people who do this work. Because, you know, there's definitely a very different perspective. We like to have academia. There's a very unique perspective with that, but we also need those boots on the ground because sometimes it can look very, very different from that perspective as well.
That is all that I see right now in the Q&A and the chat.
So I think that's it for the questions. And again, thanks for all the panelists for hanging in there and being part of this. We really appreciate you. And we hope.
One other question, if we can.
Yes.
Someone said, I know that you said it was up to law enforcement to have the specialized forensic interviewer, but what if they say they don't have it in their budget?
So I think so if you're talking to law enforcement and they say they don't have it in their budget, I suggest anything that has to do with funding for the forensic interview, I would just give them our contact information or have us get in touch with them because we deal with that all the time. It's very easy for us to navigate that. And the suggestions that I could give to you are more general in nature. All law enforcement is going to have some sort of ADA accommodation as part of their budget. And then again, the victim service side, there's funding specifically for that as well. So as far as the funding of who would be responsible for paying for the forensic interview, that is something that we can easily navigate. So just go ahead and get us involved. And that, you know, could really kind of expedite things as well.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you. All right. I think that's everything. Thank you so much. If you have questions, please reach out to us. Otherwise, have a wonderful day. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you.